pretende con este encuentro es abrirnos a las otras experiencias desde las voces de quienes experimentan, entre ellas las mujeres. Las mujeres y la mirada feminista desde la experimentación, desde la multidisciplinaridad y desde la revisión histórica. Para ello hemos invitado a 3 cineastas, Courtney Stephens, Anisia Uzeyman y Bette Gordon. Y para moderar esta mesa, para conducirla, hemos invitado a Natalia Durand, una colega, crítica, investigadora, que ha hecho trabajos sobre los encuentros en la micropolítica, el cine y la literatura. Escribe y estudió comunicación y filosofía en la UNAM. En 2018 ganó el concurso Fósforo, que es donde yo la conocí, y tuve el gran encuentro y gran fortuna de saber de su trabajo, y a partir de entonces no dejo de seguir lo que realiza. Ha hecho entrevistas, conversatorios con distribuidoras y festivales de cine, ha publicado en distintos medios como Tierra Adentro y Correspondencias. También participa en charlas y programas radiofónicos, impartió clases en la UNAM y actualmente trabaja en Arte 7. Muchísimas gracias, Natalia, por aceptar a conducir esta conversación y muchísimas gracias a nuestras invitadas por compartir su trabajo en el festival y por participar de esta conversación. Pues nada, los dejo con ellas y al final tendremos un espacio para preguntas y respuestas. Hasta luego.
Hola a todos, qué gusto encontrarnos. Me gustaría, pues bueno, primero agradecerles a todos los que están aquí, por supuesto a nuestras invitadas. Y bueno, creo que me toca también presentarlas, ¿no? Abril ya nos contó un poco también esta parte del festival, digamos que busca crear, digamos, estos espacios para pensar cómo narrarnos desde la diferencia. Entonces, este es un poco un espacio para eso. Entonces, voy a presentar aquí a mi lado, empiezo por Bette Gordon, que es una pionera del cine independiente estadounidense, es conocida por sus atrevidas exploraciones de temas relacionados con la sexualidad, el deseo y el poder, temas que me gustaría tratáramos un poco. También sus películas se han proyectado en Estados Unidos y en el extranjero, así como en los principales festivales de cine, y su obra forma parte en colecciones permanentes en museos y cinetecas de todo el mundo. Sus películas más conocidas son Variety, del 83, Luminous Motion, del 2000, y Handsome Harry, del 2009. Gordon's Greed, del 86, fue parte de la película colectiva Seven Women, Seven Sins, realizada junto con otras cineastas reconocidas internacionalmente, incluyendo a Chantal Akerman y Ulrike Oettinger. También se han hecho numerosas retrospectivas internacionales de su obra. Continuando con Anisia Uzeyman. Ella es actriz, dramaturga y directora nacida en Ruanda. Como actriz, Anisia protagonizó Tay de Alain Gomi y Agiti Mon Amour de Getty Felin. Su película experimental Dream States, rodada enteramente con iPhone, se estrenó en el 2016 y su primer libro, Salomea, Salomea, será publicado por Nota Cult en el otoño de 2021. O sea que ya está publicado. Muy bien, y termino con Courtney Stephens. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Courtney es una cineasta cuyas películas experimentales y de no ficción exploran los contornos del lenguaje, la geografía histórica y la vida de las mujeres. Su obra se exhibe a nivel internacional en lugares como el MoMA, la National Gallery, el Barbican Center, Exploratorium, Garage Museum, el BAMFA, el Poetry Project y en festivales de cine que incluyen la Berlinale, el Festival de Cine de Nueva York, South by Southwest, el Festival de Documental de Ámsterdam, Punto de Vista, el Festival de Documental de Montreal, AFIFest y los festivales internacionales de cine de Hong Kong, Mumbai, Luxemburgo, San Francisco, Camden. También fue becaria Fulbright en la India y una de las 25 nuevas caras del cine independiente de la revista Filmmaker. Graduada por el American Film Institute, cofundó el microcine Beggy Cloud en Los Ángeles, y también ha sido curadora de programas de cine para el Getty, el Museum of Moving Image, Union Dogs y el Flaherty en Nueva York. Entonces, bueno, creo que no es menor, no son menores las ponentes de hoy, lo cual para mí es un honor, la verdad. Entonces, bueno, creo que solamente sobre las preguntas quisiera más bien para todas. Primero me gustaría empezar con una pregunta para todas, que sería a partir de algo que voy a hacer un poco de trampa, porque esta pregunta la lanza Courtney en su película, en la película que está ahorita en el festival, que es Terra Femme. Y digamos que la pregunta es muy sencilla y me gusta porque ella tampoco la responde, pero bueno, podríamos discutir al respecto justo ahora, ¿no? Y la pregunta es, ¿existe una mirada femenina? Es decir, algo, ella lo llama a female gaze. ¿Existe algo, digamos, que se pueda diferenciar como tal? Creo que es un tema que se está discutiendo con mucha intensidad y no solamente en el cine, en muchísimos espacios en este momento. Me gustaría que habláramos como de las posibilidades de esto, pero también de las limitantes, ¿no? de esta idea, ¿no? Bueno, Courtney habla de ello directamente en su película. Anisia, quizá tal vez también desde alguna otra problematización particular sobre la identidad, que creo que es algo que está en su película, que también se está exhibiendo ahorita en el festival, que es Neptune Frost. Quizá alguna problematización sobre lo que implica también en eso étnica o lingüísticamente, pero también Bette, que también he visto en entrevistas, me gusta mucho cómo ha criticado tener nombres, ¿no? ¿Cuál sería la limitante también de tener nombre? Me gusta mucho que hay una entrevista donde a Bette, digamos que ella misma cuestiona el si podría llamarse cineasta, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuáles serían estos límites de que exista una mirada femenina, las potencias y límites de esto, ¿no? No sé, quizá Courtney, ya que tú lanzaste la pregunta en tu película, si quieras empezar.
So the phrase is brought up in the film largely to fall apart. So, I mean, it's not something I answer because I think it's something that's meant to unravel, right? And that, you know, the logic of asking that question actually does more work than answering it, right? That if we ask the question of, is somebody conditioned by the experiences that they've had or the, you know, that the body that they have, does that affect the way that they create images? Of course. And so for me, the question is meant to challenge the idea that there can never be a neutral gaze, right? That's actually the thing that asking if, you know, 50% or whatever, you know, some portion of a population is affected by the life they lead should challenge the notion of objectivity and the way that has been, that we can ever, you know, have something like that. So, yeah.
Thanks, Courtney.
Well, yeah, I think names are given by others, and that it is their necessity to give names when they give it, either the name, gender, or you know, race, or all those concepts with names, colors, and are given by people who needs it. And so I guess I'm hesitating between letting them deal with it and then in the same time reclaiming it and make something of it that belongs to me. Yes, everybody has a gaze, a different gaze. The feminine gaze is a multitude of gazes, right? And maybe what we can do is reclaiming it and in the same time assuming our differences in it. And where those names, with the knowledge that they are limiting when they're given by others, but that we can free them if we take them to another, fight. If we take them to fight, if we take them to free ourselves. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
The term was coined initially by Laura Mulvey in her essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, The Male Gaze. And by male gaze, in trying to understand how mainstream cinema positioned women as the object of that male gaze, she never meant it literally, as in the male gaze. It was part of the apparatus of cinema and the apparatus of narrative. So it was a concept as opposed to a experiential, biological word. And so I'm very, the word male gaze for me stood for the patriarchal construction of, or the male construction of cinema and of other institutions, in fact, of culture and society. And so it's now being used, female gaze, in a problematic way for me, and I don't support or want to use the term because it infers that I can only see through a particular gaze, even if that female gaze, if there is such a thing, because I don't think that there necessarily is. I'm somebody who likes subversion. I like to take what exists and mess it up, subvert it, look at it from another angle, disrupt it. I'd like to be a disruptor, so I'm happy to take these institutions in which we live and poke holes from underneath and from the side. That suits me as a filmmaker better than having to define myself as a female filmmaker. I'm always a filmmaker, but having to put that label is something I hope, on the one hand, I'm glad for more representation in the workplace, but I also would like to be a filmmaker like my male colleagues who don't go around saying, hello, I'm a male filmmaker. So why can't I just be a filmmaker? But yet, the industry has not supported the work of women and has not invited them easily into the academy and the institution. So we do have to fight for equity within the workplace, and that will never stop. But in terms of making films, I think that I prefer, again, just to be a disruptor of what I see as the institutional, ways in which people construct all kinds of things like identities, and I'm uncomfortable with this. And I know that the term female gaze, it disturbs me because it feels biological. My friend Kathy Bigelow said the camera doesn't have biology. Of course, in the hands of, I'm a director, but I also work with so many other people on my team, and they all add to this work that I make. So it seems restrictive and overly simplifying something that is very complicated. So the more I hear this term female gaze used, the more reductive it feels to me, and I don't necessarily support it.
Muchas gracias. Sí, creo que en realidad estamos de acuerdo, porque sí, me parecen términos interesantes, ¿no? Quizá hablar de algo neutral gaze, decía Courtney, pero también como esta necesidad de nombrarnos nosotros mismos, y también problematizando que la cosa es bastante más compleja que reducirlo a algo, una determinante biológica, ¿no? Pero bueno, creo que no me gustaría soltar ese hilo de cómo nos nombramos, y esta pregunta es para Anisia, o también si alguien más quiere agregar, creo que adelante un poco así lo pensé. Preguntas un poco para alguien en específico, pero si alguien más quiere, por favor, ¿no? Digamos, esta pregunta es sobre la identidad, ¿no? La identidad como este espacio poroso, abierto también a fluctuaciones, y lo digo especialmente porque la película con la que está ahora Anisia en Ficunam trata temas, por ejemplo, de la migración, de la diáspora africana, pero también incluso la identidad de género como este espacio poroso, ¿no? Del, digamos, el personaje principal de la película Neptune, o no sé si llamarlo principal, pero un personaje importante, es un hacker intersexual, ¿no? Entonces también pensar, por un lado, lo femenino, pero también la identidad de género como algo absolutamente otro, algo intermedio, ¿no? Entonces quizá sobre eso también me gustaría preguntarte cuál es la importancia de la identidad y cuál sería como, pues sí, la importancia de lo que decías, de nombrarnos a nosotros mismos, de hacerlo nosotros, ¿no? Quizá que nos contaras un poco más sobre esto.
Neptune for us has that desire to talk about fluidity, right? About choosing for ourselves who we are, and finding the intersections that are producing that are giving us our power back, right? That are like helping us to reclaim our own power. And I was recently, there is a debate in America where they don't want people to be called gay. They banned the word gay. And so it is this exact same problem reversed, right? I do think that the most difficult in face of power, of the structural power, of the structural patriarchal white power is to be able to define ourselves something that is like beyond binary things, beyond what is comfortable for the society and for the structure to deal with. It is comfortable, it has been made comfortable for the society to deal with gender in a, binary way, with social problems in binary ways, like poor, rich, with, in images too, beauty, ugliness. I mean, all of this is like all the time limiting our ability to be responsible, to be empowered, and to also expand our political engagement, right? I think all of this is made to maintain us in a certain place that is arranging a structure. And so I think for the fluidity to enter the debate, for the interconnection to enter the debate, for people to revindicate their, their multiplicity and their specificity, and also all the complexity of a human being, is what is disrupting a structural, desire to control, and to also, the control has always the same goal. I think it's exploitation of. It always seemed to be made for a small group to take advantage of a big number of people. And so it goes into every industry, into every domain of life, be it family, be it justice, be it like, and so I think Neptune Frost was a desire to explore the possibilities, also to reclaim stories that are very ancient and that have been like taken away from us by that power, by that patriarchal power, by that colonization. All of that is the same thing, right? It's the same idea of exploitation. And so on fluidity, what is very interesting, for instance, we shot the film in Rwanda, and in Rwanda, story of fluidity have been existing since a very long time. It's a part of the fairy tales, of folk stories. It's nothing new. What is new is the imposition and the control of that narrative. It's the colonization that brought up the idea of a fixed identity, be it gender or tribal, or all the fixations have been brought up over there by colonization, and I think in a lot of places. And I think colonization is a good example of structure that impose themselves on societies in order to exploit them. I think it's the only goal of it, actually. So that's so yeah, it's a desire to go to go beyond the expectation of our and also sometimes we throw ourselves in it's a work of every day, and I think it's the political work that we have to do to always question where we position ourselves in that dialogue, right? It goes so, we can slide so quickly into being accomplice of those systems. And that is the work of the every day, every minute, every second of an artist, I think, is to reposition, re-question, and yeah.
Thank you very much. Ahora quizá también para seguir con un hilo en ese, me parece también ese tejido, creo que también tanto Bette como Courtney, desde lados distintos, creo que proponen, digamos, una forma de hacerle frente a ese tipo de, pues yo creo que disminuciones de esta complejidad para ver, digamos, lo amplio que puede ser este espectro, ¿no? Creo que es algo que también está mucho en este tiempo en la conversación. ¿Cómo le hacemos frente a estos aparatos binarios, por ejemplo, ¿no? A estos grandes dispositivos, a estas instituciones, ¿no? Entonces, me gustaría preguntarle a Bette, quizá como para seguir con esto de la representación, pero también desde otra arista, que sería temas que están en sus películas, ¿no? Como es el cuerpo, particularmente el cuerpo de las mujeres, pero el cuerpo en general, y el deseo, ¿no? Pienso, por ejemplo, que hay temas que incluso hoy siguen siendo transgresores, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en Luminous Motion hay una pregunta por la relación entre la sexualidad y la maternidad, ¿no? Es un tema que ahorita también estamos, creo que, hablando al respecto. O en Variety, ¿no? Como esta mujer que vende boletos en un cine porno y también experimenta como su cuerpo desde una diferencia que confronta, yo creo, de muchas formas al canon, ¿no? En fin, bueno, como los ejemplos podrían ser bastante más, pero bueno, me gustaría entonces a Bette que preguntarle totalmente con lo que estaba diciendo hace rato, que es algo muy potente, me parece, ¿no? Sería preguntarle, cómo vemos a las mujeres a través del cine, también cómo has hecho tú para confrontar, digamos, a ese canon hegemónico y también, pues bueno, cómo se relaciona el cuerpo y el deseo en todo esto, ¿no? Sobre todo en tus películas.
That's a huge question. Yeah, let's see. I will take a specific film, my film Variety. When I came up with the idea for the film, as I said before, Laura Mulvey had written this essay which positioned the subject of the look male and the object of the look female. And as I was turning this around in my head and the question of who is in the audience, I was interested in reversing that in some way. And I thought about one of my favorite genres, which is the thriller genre or film noir, as a classic representation of a kind of classical cinema. And certainly the idea of dark streets at night, where women are often told not to go because it's dark and you might not be safe. But also dark streets offered a kind of possibility, an unrestrained sense of female sexuality. Women in film noir actually had positions that were different than in other genres, perhaps. And so the idea of a female, maybe detective, who was exploring the night, certainly coming from the noir genre, intrigued me enough that I thought about changing the paradigm, and I decided that my female character would be a voyeur, would be the looker, the follower, and I took a Hitchcock film, Hitchcock being sort of the prominent controller of the male gaze, and I said, what if instead of Jimmy Stewart following Kim Novak in Vertigo, what if Christine, the character in my film, would follow a man who keeps coming to the cinema. She gets a job selling tickets, she needs a job, everybody needs a job. Just so happens that somebody was leaving and she gets a job to sell tickets at a pornographic movie theater. Porn interested me because I thought, what does pornography have to say about desire for women? What kind of desires or fantasies does it raise? And I never saw porn as a monolithic oppressor. In fact, I never wanted to sort of position myself in the victim position. I thought, what can I do? How can I use some of what porn offers and change it or turn it on its side so that we can see that the construction in film of pornography in terms of the image, and especially in film, is that it sustains, it substitutes the look for the touch. In porn, in a film, you can't have what you see on the screen. It's an illusion, so you can't have it, and you can't touch it. But the look is powerful, so it substitutes the look for the touch. And it sustains desire for ever promised but never found gratification. It continues this cycle of desire. So does narrative. Why do we watch narrative films? Because there's a sense of desire even in the construction of narrative. And so the female character in my film not only repositions herself as the holder of this desire and as all viewers, it sustains desire, but we can't ever have the object on the screen. So the story in the end is really about how narrative progresses and leaves us at the end with wanting more. And of course, my conclusion was to be somewhat open. What am I exploring in terms of the body? So I was interested in the gap, and I still am interested in this, even more so now as the restriction from a younger generation on what is allowable and what isn't has come into question. I'm interested in the gap between my sexual identity and my sexual fantasy. and they don't always match. And so that took me to the unconscious, and I asked myself the question, the unconscious, for whatever it is, doesn't necessarily distinguish between clean sex and dirty sex, or sex versus love. There's a drive. Men are not the only owners of power, violence, sexual exploration. Women too. So I thought if I could ask those questions in a film, which became Variety, through the character of Christine, who is in a booth, so she's being looked at, but she can see. So there's this double look. And so for me, when we talk about gaze, I talk about the look. What is she looking at, and who is looking at her? And in that way, it took me through, even when I was beginning the film, I would go in and out of Times Square porn stores, and a lot of my friends worked as strippers and bars and got me entrance into places that I might not have gotten into had they not worked there. But one day I walked into a porn store, and guys were looking at magazines, and there were booths in the back, and I put my quarter in, and the guy who was the manager said, "You have to leave." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you can't be in here." And I thought, how interesting. It's okay for me to be on the page of the magazine or on the screen, but I can't be in the space? So, I didn't want to leave, and I didn't, but eventually I did. So I was interested in that, like I said before, in disrupting those male spaces, in owning them, or at least making them uncomfortable by my presence. So the film plays with that. I don't know that I have a big answer to the question of how do we represent desire and what about the body. I do know that I'm somewhat troubled by a sense of a current generation being less comfortable with the body, some idea that there's some films you can watch and some films you can't, depending on who made them, and trigger warnings, which is another aspect of a newer generation, but I'm trying to incorporate my ideas, which are much more, I want to punch. I don't want to retreat. I want to go forward. I want to mess things up. I want to say, yes, this is possible and that is possible. So I don't know if I'm answering the question or not. I'm just free associating, thinking about what got me interested in making a film like Variety. I was also interested in language. I had a friend named Kathy Acker who passed away. She was a poet and a writer, and she spoke her sexuality. She would write, sometimes taking male literature like Dickens, and substitute the characters for herself and get up in front of an audience and read her own pornography. And I'd never heard a woman speaking her fantasies out loud, sometimes not even to your closest friends. And I thought that was brave, that was powerful, and I invited Kathy to work with me, and so we wrote a series of monologues or stories about fantasy and sexuality that became Christine speaking our fantasies, her fantasy out loud, which I still think is a subversive activity and a good one, because generally we are spoken, not speaking, when it comes to all kinds of sexuality, anything and everything. So at least that's a start. It's a topic that I'm sure we could all talk about forever. But that's my first answer. I could have second, third, and fourth answers later. Thanks.
Justo desde esta imposibilidad de establecerlo, ¿no? De pensar el deseo, el cuerpo es esto, como enfrentarse a eso siempre en movimiento, ¿no? Y creo que hay una arista más que creo que puede responder también a cómo enfrentarse a estos dispositivos hegemónicos desde otro lado, que sería el trabajo de Courtney también, porque ella, y por ahí va mi pregunta, digamos, ella se relaciona con el material de archivo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, la película que está ahorita en Ficunam, Terra Femme, trabaja con material de archivo, ¿no? Sobre todo con cintas caseras de viajes, ¿no? Grabados por mujeres, o digamos que tenemos casi la certeza de pensar que casi todos fueron grabados por mujeres, ¿no? Entonces, ahí me gustaría preguntarle ¿cómo te relacionas tú con el archivo cuando te enfrentas a eso? Digamos, incluso como, ¿qué entiendes tú por archivo? Porque creo que estamos en un momento del mundo también donde esas comprensiones están yendo hacia otros lados, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué entiendes tú por archivo? ¿Y cómo ha sido para ti trabajar críticamente con él, ¿no? O sea, como, ¿cuáles serían también los límites de esa materialidad o no que entendemos por archivo, ¿no?
That's a good question. So the archives that I'm using in my film they're amateur films, right? So I mean, in a sense, they're private documents, and they're not sort of a media archive in the way that we think about kind of past media that was meant for public consumption. So in that way, I'm dealing with things that possibly, weren't even meant to be screened, in the time that they were made. So they were made with a totally different intention. And so, I'm thinking a lot, and I think all of us are, about, and I know that's one of the subjects of this panel, but peripheries and margins and centers and decentering and recentering and the logic of margins and how we can do work that isn't just using peripheral experience to kind of, in some ways, comment upon and therefore sort of recreate a center, but to actually question the logic that creates margins, right? So I think these archives, in being private, one of the things that's complicated about using them for me has been sort of, what is the end of doing so, right? Is it to say, here are these lost auteurs, and it's important to bring their names into the canon of sort of female nonfiction or something like that? And I mean, my perspective is totally not. I think actually what they do is they kind of speak to the widespread creativity of anonymous individuals and citizens, right? And so it's not at all my kind of intention to recover them as a way of kind of critiquing, saying they've earned their place in a sort of professional sort of historiography. It's more to say there's all these invisible figures in the historical record that never entered the historical record for a set of reasons that are worth thinking about, but that actually just, that it's an ellipse that goes on and on and on, and there's sort of this, these are documents that happen to be saved and happen to be shot, but these point of views are sort of infinite, that there's these sort of billions of private points of view that, I don't know, that found dignity through the medium of cinema, right? They were sort of dignified and recorded in a sense, but sort of they could have not been, and how to sort of celebrate that. But also at the same time, they're really complicated documents. They're these women were low status by gender, in some way, but many of them were high status by class and race. And so the films are really at these intersections of, privilege. And I think that looking at documents that have complexity and ambiguity in sort of the, in the way that they, figure into, both oppression and kind of exclusion is, something that I think we're ready to do, to think about things that fall outside of, I don't know, simply sort of good, bad, and other sorts of binaries. So.
Gracias, Courtney. Sí, creo que parece que no está conectado, pero sí lo está. Yo creo que sí están, creo que cada uno está proponiendo desde lados diferentes un poco cómo hacerle frente a todo esto, ¿no? Y bueno, quizá nunca es mal momento, pero bueno, este puede ser uno para hablar un poco, me gustaría quizá de del futuro, o me gustaría ponerlo con este concepto, que sería la futurabilidad, ¿no? Que sería la capacidad de producir futuros. Y por futuros hablo en esta multiplicidad, porque creo que justamente desde estos lugares tan distintos que habla cada una, hay una apuesta también por pensar como en otros futuros, ¿no? O sea, pienso, quizá hay un concepto que me gusta mucho para pensar Neptune Frost, que puede ser afrofuturismo, ¿no? Que estaría quizá jugándose ahí también con esta relación con la ciencia ficción. O también en Courtney, en Terra Femme, hay un momento donde dice, ¿y si pudiéramos imaginarnos un archivo que fuera identificable por sensación y no por nombre? ¿Qué sería eso, no? Creo que ahí hay algo muy interesante tal vez que podríamos mencionar. O Betty, bueno, creo que ya lo estuvo mencionando bastante, ¿no? Como esta posibilidad, pero también imposibilidad de nombrar al deseo, ¿no? Y de pensarlo como algo ya determinado. Pero no sé, cuando pensamos en esta capacidad incluso del cine o de su trabajo en particular, quisiera que me contaran, no sé, quien quiera o todas, hablar sobre eso, ¿no? La futurabilidad, la capacidad de producir futuros en el cine. No sé quién quiera.
I can barely deal with the present.
Maybe Anisia.
Okay.
I think in Neptune Frost it's a subject.
Yeah, it is, but you know, we never use that word by ourselves.
Yeah.
It's again a name, a genre that came from the outside, that I think came because it was people needed to grab where this film was and what it was, and since it is talking to the possibility of imagining how would you call that? Imagining a space that is freer. I think. I think people needed that word in order to make links, to make their own link with the visual that they were encountering. It is a film that is shot in Rwanda with new actors, new artists, in the language in Kinyarwanda, in Kirundi, and in the languages that people talk over there. So it's not in English, it's not, you know, the industry language. And it's also situated in an alternative reality because those people travel to a place that is a village made of computer board called Digitaria, where they are awakened to their power, right? And so the visual, the work with the artist, the production design, and all of that, we work towards between using, you know, materials that are usually for, you know, garbage, recuperating materials in order to transform them into materials that are very, very futuristic, and also there is a component in the film that is related to the computers, right? And to that space. So the deep web and all those spaces, those new spaces that we are inhabiting right now. and how we found ourselves in those new spaces, those virtual spaces, those hacker spaces, those wires, and how in those spaces, how we are not reproducing what is proposed in the material space, right? In a society, how can you reinvent that space from the perspective of Africans from the continent? And so it's true that it's a musical, and also it's a huge ensemble, and I do think that for people, the last reference that they have for that type of film is maybe Sun Ra, right? Which is to say that it's just because there is not a lot of references, and I do think that the term Afrofuturism was, given in terms of just giving you some. We called it a sci-fi musical because it talks about technology and about where that technology is sourced and where it can bring us, right? And so it is, to me, interesting that we have that term Afrofuturism, but I think other words can be invented. I think the other day we were talking about Octavia Butler, who is a sci-fi, who was defined as a eco-fi, and I thought it was interesting. Eco-fi, as also talking about how those environment where are, how do we reassess and how do we reconnect with things that are maybe made of, I don't know, how do we recycle things without falling into the idea of the past is better. And so how do we inhabit the present in order for this present to be more attached to what's gonna be in the future? Then how can we go back to the past? You see? I think there is a relationship to time that is very interesting, which is we are witnessing a moment here in history where people are more interested in what happened, or they want to go back, or it was better before, or things that are. And yesterday we watched a movie on India, on the protest, the student protest in India. And I thought there was something interesting in there where the director says, everything is, things happen, revolution happened, people spoke, political engagement happened, revolutions, etc. But they are all linked to their time, to the moment it happened. And we cannot take, let's say, what was said in 1968 the same way as we cannot take it for, as an example or as a model for what's happening today. We are informed by it, but what is today is today. And I thought it was very interesting. And I think that the future is really a travel, a link between what the past inform into the present and how we deal with the present to inform the future. So there is a kind of conundrum, I think, something that is very interesting in terms of we travel through time on a regular basis, I think, and it's a question of seizing the present, and in that present you can see how the future is gonna play. So Afrofuturism is also, I just think, our, as African, as Black people, as it's our space, the space that is given to us to go beyond the expectations. I think that's where that space is. It's beyond the expectation of our narrative, beyond miserabilism, beyond, you know, when you do a film on the continent, or when you talk about certain topics, the industry expect, and also it's a full on, I think, education to be open to many narratives coming from places like that. We often are given from those spaces a certain type of narrative, an acceptable narrative, a narrative that's going to make you feel that you know, or that you are, or that going to give you access to the emotion that you are looking for in those spaces. And those spaces are often disempowered. They're often seen from the perspective of the outside. And Afrofuturism, I think, is that space that is shareable in your understanding that there are many stories and many ways of telling those stories coming from those places. It doesn't have to be limited by the demand, or I don't even know if it's a demand, but by the ID that are in place today. And so I think that's why that name come upon on Neptune Frost. It's really a work on a film about what means freedom too, right? What is to be free creatively, narratively, to free the narratives, I think that's what that space probably offers to the people that see the movie. Call it a sci-fi musical.
Sí, bueno, creo que también la película justo está en este campo de la dificultad de hablar de la fluidez, ¿no? Bueno, pero ¿cómo la nombramos, no? Y creo que para entrar en festivales de cine justo sería difícil, bueno, pero ¿qué es esto? ¿Es un musical? ¿Sci-fi? ¿O de qué se trata, ¿no? Y creo que es muy interesante porque en muchos registros creo que esta película está poniendo en cuestión esas cosas, ¿no? Desde pensar incluso como el lugar disruptivo que tendría el lenguaje o la música también como un espacio para pensar esto lejos como de cualquier dispositivo, ¿no? O sea, incluso el habla está atravesada por otra cosa, ¿no? ¿Qué se estaría moviendo ahí? Me parece muy interesante y también pues criticar este tipo de conceptos también, ¿no? No sería suficiente para Neptune Frost decirle Afrofuturism, sería un nombre como quizá impuesto y uno de tantos, pero me queda claro que sí podrían ser bastantes más, ¿no? Sí, sin duda. Muchas gracias, Anisia. No sé si Courtney o Peri quieren decir algo solo sobre, o la dificultad de hablar del futuro porque el presente ya es demasiado. No sé si quieren decir algo ahí sobre el futuro.
I was thinking in terms of what Anisia is saying about, we started out talking about categorization and sort of, the violence that comes with naming things. And this is maybe speaking also back to your question about archives, but I spent a lot of time in archives researching for my film, and a lot of what I was looking at is the way using language that films or images were described by the people who had entered them into these archives, right? And how this metadata ultimately was determining who would ever find these documents, but also how they were valued, you know, how values were placed on them. And it seems very niche, but we are living so much inside the internet at this point in terms of looking for information and looking for you know, images as well, that the logic by which things are sorted has, it's become very silent, but it's, you know, it is informing the way that we're navigating you know, our access to news and the outside world so profoundly, you know, and of course this is evident in things like, you know, the, you know, fake news and the way that different kind of news streams are, you know, kind of corner different people into sort of isolated realities. But yeah, I do think that the control of, or the repositioning of, like, the data stream is not a neutral thing, you know, I mean, it is also kind of inhabited by the ghosts of past forms of sorting through the world. And so, you know, I don't have any, unfortunately, I don't have you know, a optimistic outlook in that sense, but I do think that that is an intervention that is, you know, is part of what we're dealing with in terms of accumulation right now, because we are living in such a moment of accumulation.
From just a very practical sense, something I go back to, is that one thing we know for sure is that even when we think we know what the future might bring, we're often wrong. There is no way. So many times you think, okay, 3D is going to be the next big thing, and everybody's buying 3D this and 3D that. You know, it doesn't land. You know, certainly with so many other things that have been predicted to be, it's so unknowable that the only thing that you can say about the future is that it's at least partially, maybe more than partially, unknowable. We can project, we can predict, we can imagine, and we can dream, but I just find it almost frustrating, for me anyway, to think about that. But I like the idea that Courtney mentioned, which is about living a present and working in a present that takes into account the past, and living that and working that so precisely that it will, in some way or another, the work we all do, engender a future which we don't know. We have no idea what it'll be like, but somehow it'll be based probably a bit on the past and a bit on the present and on some projection of the future. So the unknowability of everything is somehow counter to this desire that we have because of the internet to know everything. But isn't unknowability maybe even more interesting? I don't know.